How many episodes are up, Jack?
140 or so,
You've done 140 of these?
something like that.
And what was your first? That's amazing. That's a lot.
We
What was your?
started we started recording, so I want to interject that Daniel and I are here
Yes.
to talk about Daniel. I've known since I was married to his sister many years ago, who I still love, who's still one of
Yay!
my favorite people, and who my present wife loves too. So we all have, and she remarried her first husband, and I call him my husband-in-law because we're still connected, and I love him, and he's a great guy. And so we have, when we do anything together, it's a very illuminated experience. And Daniel is my still brother-in-law and brother in arms in other ways. So we're going to talk today about him and I.
Amen.
It's an interview, I call it.
Interview. Amen.
Yeah.
And maybe thinking about thinking has enlightened you and those around you in a way, or freed, let's say, not enlightened, but freed those you and those around you to love someone like your ex-wife and her husband, and engender that capacity in your present wife. I mean, that is, it's not unheard of, but it's certainly, those things can go different ways. So if being aware of one's thinking can help one choose loving thoughts when others are available, amen to that. That's a great thing. When we talk, and when I've listened to various episodes of your podcast, one of the things I keep thinking, okay, how do I carry this? Like, I'm fascinated by the way you talk about thinking, and then how do I carry this with me in daily life to my to my benefit and to the benefit of those around me. And I look for hooks, or a hook that I can hang my hat on, where, okay, I'm in this situation. Can I think about my thinking enough to choose a good thought here, and to choose a thought that will help a difficult situation?
Well, and my suspicion is, my experience is, and my sense is that we've been thinking incorrectly so long that we're constantly trying to think better about what we're doing that is wrong inherently. So it's always a question of, how do I act a little better, when I've never had anybody come to me and say, help me act worse and have more negative thoughts. So there, to me, that's a pretty good indication, if you look at it conceptually, that there's something wrong at the core of the thinking that we're trying to get better at, which would tell me that we have an urge to be better, even in the face of something that seems intractable and impossible to either overcome or to stop. That sort of wrongness. But to your point, if you're in a situation, you and I, for example, if I have ideas about you, if I have ideas that I think are true, then the lens of which I see you through is going to be false to some degree. And if I have a lifelong of those ideas, there's a good chance how I'm seeing you is very, very distinct from how you actually are, and simply limited to how I see you as being. And that too then would apply to all else I'm seeing in this wrong way as being considered normal and actual, when in fact it's just delusional.
Well, you know, my question, I think I see what you're saying, but in my thinking and considering, and I wanted to ask you what you thought about this, but I want to say this right. Bad thinking, wrong thinking, negative thinking, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that come from, or could you make a case that that all comes from a previous incarnation of humanity, when fight or flight was everything for survival and for to eat and thrive? You had to you had to develop fight or flight.
Mhm.
Okay. So that is now, for most people, much less of an important mechanism, because we can go to the grocery store and get turkey burgers, right? We don't need, and so much negative of scared thinking,
Mhm.
to me, has its root in ancient primordial humanity that had to have fight or flight as the number one threshold for all thought. And now it's so ingrained in us as human beings, we're walking around with it in a time when it's like way overkill, and we don't need all that fear. We don't need all that carefulness and
It's good
negative.
insight.
Huh?
It's good insight. And my suspicion is instinct is actually an awareness that there's an emergency that needs to be attended. And so what happens? Our body immediately releases adrenaline, giving us added energy, added capacity to function in relation to this actual threat. And for a lot of recorded human history, just eating enough was a threat.
Yes.
Breathing clean air wasn't a threat. Finding clean water wasn't a threat. But if you didn't have, if the air was polluted by a volcano that had erupted, clearly it would create toxic conditions that would be hard to survive if you didn't have any better idea what to do with those things. So the emergency response in our system is well designed to actually confront emergencies. So presently, we have the luxury of most of those food, shelter, clothing issues being resolved. So what have we done? Use that same form of thinking about an emergency that we're creating. We're creating an emergency, our own thinking, by imagining we're not in reality, because thinking becomes our only reality when we think our thoughts are truth and reality. So what have we created? An environment that our body is living with that we can't escape because it's internal to the experience we're inducing. And now we're using all of those bodily chemicals for something that we're creating in an environment of our own making. And trying to
Right.
run from it, which would be impulsivity and reactivity and compulsivity, all addictive tendencies, trying to run from it while it's being created by us has us culpable for maintaining it while we think there's something to escape from, while we're obviously sick enough to continue to maintain it. At the same time, claiming we don't want to be doing it, we're affected by it as though it's happening to us rather than being caused by us. So instincts by nature are, the difference is they're designed to help us survive so that we can thrive. And this thing we're doing based on insane thinking, I would call it induced insanity, by making believe we're the creators of reality, which means there is no other reality. And yet we live thinking we don't belong where we are, which is the only place we ever are. And the traumatic effect of that is 24 hours a day, because we're always seeking, searching, looking for that place that never seems to be found, since humans have been seeking from the beginning and still are, rather than conceding it's already where we are, it's where we've always been, it's the only place we can ever be. And start to put that to rest, meaning now we have captured the capacity of thinking to begin to express the nature of nature rather than the nature of unnatural, unhealthy, illogical, unreasonable ideas.
Yes. And there's two things. Yes. I mean, look, I get about 32.1% of the words you like. You're so, you have such a world, Jack, of three dimensions, and you live in this space, and I'm hoping to, crawl up the ladder and poke my head in, and look around. And but one of the things I've thought a lot about that fits with this. Okay, there's something called, mm, my daughter's in school to become a psychiatrist, and there's this thing called, and I'll think of the name. It's a level. Okay, it's how much It's a measurable level that how much fight or flight your body over time, how much time your body has spent in fight or flight. Okay. It's named after a guy who discovered this idea.
So it's sort of the cumulative effect of this condition.
Correct. Okay.
Yes.
So when you think about that way, it's like, oh, this is something you can measure. And this is something that would be wise to diminish for health, right?
You would think.
Yeah. I mean,
sanely.
Huh?
To think sanely, you would think that.
You would. To me, you look like a guy who doesn't, these days, doesn't spend a lot of time in fight or flight. You're not, by you're a joyful guy. You radiate joy and relaxation, so you're not. Now, by the way, you did experience something most people don't experience. Actually, two things that I can name right now, two major things that would tend to put somebody into fight or flight. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Of course.
Okay. So one much more recent. So to me, you're kind of living proof that there is a benefit to all this, right? A personal benefit, a relief available. Because if you're in fight or flight all the time, okay? And there's two things I want to ask what you think about.
Yes.
That fall under this heading, okay? One is exaggerated language that we use. It threw me under the bus.
Nothing's any good. Everyone's screwed up.
I'm hemorrhaging money.
Yeah. You must be a real asshole to do
that. Right. So that's one thing that I think really, it's because if words matter and language means anything, then we'd be wise to somehow at least be aware of the effect that language like that can have.
Well, and the other thing is to recognize that language is really referencing something that if it weren't known, language would not have any purpose in describing. If there were not some evidence.
Say that again.
If there was nothing, language is doing its best to refer to things that exist.
Okay.
For the most part. Now, it can also be used to make things up that are fantastic. But we would typically call that fantasy, which is what imagination is really. Imagination is used to be able to consider all sorts of things. But simply because we can consider those things, we think that they are reality, is not distinguishing the fact that our thinking isn't the reality of it. The of it is the reality. The fact that there's a present state, like aerodynamics always existed until Orville and Wilbur, they carved the wing, but the dynamic already existed in space. It was already part of the dimension of nature.
Yes.
So words are really referring, if we're thinking of words as being the definitive answer, we're doing what we've done through history, which is constantly argue over the shape of words, which is why we have hundreds of books written on the exact same topic, written in different ways, trying to get to the essence, when in fact, if we can concede that everything that's essential is already essential, and it's already essence, it's already in place, we can start thinking in terms of already having a knowing awareness of those things rather than constantly thinking we have to further define them to know them. The words are always going to be limited in some way. And the combination of words, none of us think the same way. None of us use words the same way. And yet the things we think of and the words we use are very much the same. The order of them, the velocity of them, the intonation, all those things tend to be somewhat distinct for each of us.
Truly.
So if we're using the words and then focusing on the words to answer the knowingness, we're missing the fact that if there's an absolute state of being and an absolute state of knowing, that it must be something we know. not because it's demanded of us, but because it's the nature of existence. If it's the nature of existence, how would it not be our nature? And we've thought of ourselves as exclusive from it simply because we can think of things incorrectly and make believe that the incorrect nature of our thinking gives us the right. We have the freedom and the right to do that, but to think then we have the right to make it our truth and have it become reality suggests that reality was never reality until we finally thought about it. Now, if I think my thinking is real, I don't think there's any other reality. That would lead to a sense of displacement. I don't belong here, meaning I need to be somewhere else, constantly, chronically trying to get somewhere else when the absolute certainty of my presence is always present. So I look over the certainty into doubt and uncertainty. And I would say that's what anxiety comes from. This displacement or seeming displacement. It isn't a displacement of reality. You and I, our reality never changes. If it's real, and everyone shares it. Existence shares it. But our ideas and thoughts about it are. So this isn't about thinking being wrong. It's about making believe that wrong thinking is right, where this collision starts to occur in our experience. And we seem to descend into the darkness of conflict and these haunting images because we feel, I would say, both ashamed and guilty for what we're doing. And it would be, if it's insane to do those things, one of the hallmarks of insanity is making believe you're sane. So if I'm stuck in that loop and I've got no perspective, nobody's offering me any information that might give me a chance to say, oh, I keep starting this. I keep redoing this. I keep maintaining this thought that somehow my thinking is reality rather than my thinking is a bodily function that I have to do, not that I have to do. Think of how we've turned the word have from a possessive, having something, to all of a sudden being a demand, must, shall, have to do. I have to do it. Well, that's interesting. If I had to do it, I would be doing it. I wouldn't be thinking about it. I'd just be doing it like instinct. You see a car coming at you and you're at an intersection and it's doing 80. You're probably not going to spend a lot of time wondering if the guy sees you because it occurs to the better sense shows up and bam, your feet are moving before your head. Feet are typically ahead of your head. So there's a knowingness built into our system that we all know. To the point earlier of talking to that other person, if I begin to concede that the knowingness is something we all share, and I begin to concede that that means all things, all everybody and everything. If I'm operating on that basis and considering that that is also true for the person I may have an issue with.
Well,
did you get that? If I'm considering that the infinite nature of my presence must be your presence too, if it's for anyone, it's for everyone and everything, and it's of everything and everything, everyone and everything. If that is the case, and I'm approaching you on that basis, I'm approaching you with a sense of knowing you know, rather than thinking I need to convince you of what I think I know.
I see. So
because if you have the freedom to think the way you want, the chances are I'm never going to convince you to think the way I do because you have the absolute right to think how you do. To bridge that is to start to say, look, you can think of this in any way you want. But if you think of the spirit of what the words are getting at, rather than try to debate the words, you start to notice the shared implications of language and its ability to actually reference things and offer that greater experience whenever we're willing to say, oh, I know that. I just wouldn't have described it that way. But now that you mention it, and I think we've had those experiences between us. What I'm doing is only unique to what I'm doing because I've been doing it so long, because I was crazy enough to recognize that I was crazy, that I was out of my mind with ideas that I kept trying to fix from the pedestal and the foundation of insanity, thinking what I really needed to do was use the desperation I was creating and the anxiety and think that more of the same thinking would help me overcome it, rather than say, it's the thinking I'm doing that's creating it.
Yeah, when was that? You're referring to, I mean, can you think of a moment in your life when that was the case for you?
Well, there's been many cases, because if I'm honest, I start realizing I was always being given the proper curriculum to straighten me out, but I was busy making believe it was only what I thought about that curriculum that counted. So to your point earlier, I may miss it somewhat because I didn't intersect it quickly enough to address it in a way that I think might be more apt. But if you were talking about my words and my this, it isn't what I'm doing about anything that makes the difference. Ultimately, it's what you do with it that makes the difference to you. It's not what I do. So what I say I've developed for my own level of sanity and my own level of growth and all that, it doesn't mean it's going to work for you if you decide it's not going to work for you. So I can't overcome that in you. You were talking about that being something that was useful to you, perhaps. But we tend to overlook that all the degradation of through history that humans have caused in terms of the calamity, this seemingly self-imposed destruction that we've been good at doing, is also been telling us we're on a path that isn't right because it doesn't serve the instinct of survival and thriving. To think in terms that I think the best thing I can do is kill somebody else or another group of people to better myself or my group is not conducive to survival and thriving. It's conducive to continuation of a war. It's the exact war I set off in myself when I think my thoughts are right, yours are wrong, rather than say we both have the basis of rightness in our essence as beings, and our thinking can be askewed. And if I don't take advantage of your perspective and see that you're actually offering me something, when I come up against you and think you're an idiot for doing something I don't like because you're not thinking like me, I can either see you as an asshole or I can see you as actually providing me this perspective to help me see the thoughts I'm having that are absolutely not true about you. I'm using you as an example. Rather than thanks, I say fuck you in those cases, right? That's the breakup of relationships very often. Sometimes that takes a minute to see with people. But if we all share it and start considering that that is, in fact, what truth and reality is, which is not optional, not negotiable, not changeable, it's just an absolute present state of being, it starts making sense that the religions through history and the yogis and the Buddhas and the prophets and the Maharajis and all that were talking about this the whole time. The one element that I don't think has been addressed until this last century was the addictive nature that it's mental. It starts in the brain, thinking that thoughts are real. It's having a wrong thought that I think is right creates a conflict. As soon as it's not the wrong thought. I can have all the wrong thoughts I want and say, okay, well, I can correct that. I can adjust. Clearly, this isn't working and I can adjust. As soon as I think it's right, I fight for the rightness of that wrong and end up repeating that behavior over and over and over and over again, thinking someday the harder I do it, the longer I do it, it will work. And it's basically in AA, the first step is admitting powerlessness over alcohol. The real powerlessness is in the lie that I can drink without consequence or drink without the exact same consequence I keep facing, which is that I keep drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking to prove, ironically, that I'm in control of it. I drink out of control to prove I'm in control of it because my thought structure says I can drink without any consequence. And when I think that, I go about trying to prove that. It's the same thing in this other mechanism that gets set up. And I would say it's just a mechanical dysfunction. We're given so much freedom that we're given freedom to think we're not free. That would be a very loving essence that's giving us that kind of latitude. If we were condemned to not doing this, there would be no freedom. There would be no value realized in doing it. We would be animals. We would be automatons. We would simply be functioning without thought at all. We would be thinking only about what's happening as it's happening and never have this contemplative advantage of saying, wow, there's something going on here that goes way beyond the animal instincts that I have to feed myself and to breathe and to all these things about looking good. None of that would be part of that. I would just be simply thinking about eating. Food, shelter, clothing would be the essence. And most animals are born with coats, so they don't need the clothing, just food and shelter. So we've been given something as a gift that we've turned into a liability rather than an asset. Imagination is one of the greatest things we have. Constructive imagination is very different than the destructive imagination that happens when I start imagining my thinking as reality and then wonder why I feel alone and disconnected and apart from and low self-esteem and all that stuff, because the self I make believe I become then has none of those traits whatsoever. It has no value. It has no life. It has no breathing. It has no death. And yet I consider it, my life depends on it.
It's
That's
almost
another delusion.
it's almost like you're saying, let me correct me here, but you're saying thinking you're right. Anytime you're thinking you're right, you're wrong. You're doing the
Well,
wrong.
if you're right, what's interesting is you don't need to think about it because the thing you're trying will be working. You'll be involved in the process of the thing working. If you put the key in the right car and turn the ignition, it's going to start. You're going to go to the next step. You're going to continue to make whatever that effort is. You've now engaged in actuality rather than fantasy. So it's working. You don't need to think about it anymore. It's like 2 plus 2. I do not have to go back to the rudiments of arithmetic that took me time to learn to begin to apply those things automatically with no thinking at all. So the only struggles we have emotionally and mentally, psychically, and we think spiritually, which can't be a problem because it's an absolute nature, but our thinking about it can be a problem, thus concluding that spirituality is the problem and God doesn't give us things and doesn't answer our prayers and all these kind of thoughts we have. Those all come from the idea that I'm avoiding my own culpability and creating the scarcity that I'm claiming God is giving me. So now I've gone from a simple thought of his reality, and blame God for not giving me what I've always had. How could an infinite source not? How could we all not be as that is or of that same way? That would be like lunacy to think that it has to be separate for us. We're separate from it. That means we are in fact the rulers of the universe. We are in fact the creators of truth and reality. And if that's the case, reality and truth are doomed. we're doing a good job of burning the whole thing down.
We're on our way, which brings me funny that really brings me to this other thing that I mean, there's a couple things here, but okay, we started with fight or flight, right?
Right.
At least my question to you: do you think fight or flight is too alive in us in present day, so that it's causing us much more trouble than we should have to suffer, and that the exaggerated language that we use, you know, is for some reason why we do that? I don't know. I mean, some people.
It's metaphoric.
Yeah, I mean, but wouldn't it be better to understate things? Yeah, lost a few bucks,
but it wouldn't make the
hemorrhaging
point.
money, huh?
You can't try to make the point that everything and everyone else is the problem. If you're understating it, you got to include them all. If
What do you
we're
mean?
not if I'm not admitting responsibility for what I'm creating and the lens I'm looking through is a consequence of the thinking I'm doing, I'm imagining it can't be me. So what would I imagine it is? Everything else and everyone else. So the exaggerated language becomes a natural narrative to try to develop the story that in fact I have nothing to do with what's happening. Think of this. I have absolutely nothing to do with what's happening. That means I don't exist. Isn't that a suicidal tendency? It's a prayer for not even belonging, not even having, not even being. It's a prayer to have nothing to do with everything. That's rootedness in this. That's rooted in this thinking. If we know and act like we don't, that's a choice. And to act that way, we must think there's some payoff. But the promise of a lie is that it's always a lie. It's always a broken promise. And yet the promise is, in fact, that it will always be a lie. It will never correct itself because lies don't exist in the universe. They only exist in the thinking of humans. So the difference is, in terms of the survival issue, the threats used to be external: weather, animals, lack of food, lack of fire at one point. Imagine people trying to live during the Ice Age without fire, if there was no fire then. I forget what the dates are, right? Pretty cold. You had to be able to kill, you had to be pretty developed in your ability to survive back then. Those
Yeah,
were actual threats because they were external. We're
yeah,
creating an internal threat. Addiction is an internal threat, creating an environment within our own experience that the faster we run away from it, the longer it lasts for us because it goes with us. The idea of getting away from it, from a threat, is fine when it's exterior. The idea of getting away with it becomes obvious when you begin to realize that wherever I go, it goes with me. So
Mm.
getting away with it when it comes to mental problems mean you're actually taking it with you. And we miss that point even in those words we use. Trying to get away with it. I'm actually doing that. I'm getting away with it wherever I go. So why is it always with me? And why does everybody else look responsible? Because wherever I go, that lens and my understanding is what I'm seeing through. And our seeing is not just visible. Our understanding is a form of seeing, which is why we say, do you see what I mean? We're not asking people to see what we're thinking, it's visible, but what we're thinking in our brain that we can't even see. And we try to make sense out of it through language. So my sense is we think of everybody like that because what better argument could we have that if I'm not wrong, it means everyone else must be. I might as well talk about it that way to make believe that everybody sort of buys into it, and I can begin to collect the votes of 8.5 billion people to prove that I'm right. When in fact, what am I the whole time? Wrong. So the rightness of wrong is a problem because wrong will never be right. And the only difference that distinguishes wrong from right is that one is useful and applicable and the other is not. So it isn't to say I don't do those things you're talking about, because I certainly do. I certainly still have limits. I certainly still have ideas about how well things can go, how well this conversation can go. I certainly have limits in my own ability to convey this so that people go, oh, that makes sense. I'm going to start operating on that basis. I have people that won't talk to me anymore, who've gotten severely upset over this, who think I'm attacking them because I'm simply saying, let me point. And let me tell you, I interrupt people very often intentionally because I know they're going to loop into these stories and I want to disrupt those stories. I want to give them a second to see that. One of the reasons my experience is that people are so intent on getting the not being interrupted because they think that the story they're about to tell you, which is generally trying to excuse why they had nothing to do with whatever's happening to them, if you hear the whole story, then you'll understand, like they do, the rationale and the logic. And what I know is when they're doing that, if I end up understanding it, I'm as insane as they are to make believe that that's the truth. So I don't want to participate in that. So people get upset. They think, oh, you interrupt all the time. I said, yeah, exactly. I'm interrupting a chronic monologue that is the new addiction. The addiction is you have to hear me out. People don't understand me. And I'm like, well, when what you understand is misunderstanding, the fact that they don't understand you is a healthy condition. That's good. You've got some world you might be able to rely on on that basis that's actually healthier than the thing you're doing. So we either buoy each other or sink each other. And every thought and decision we make is constantly floating or sinking the ship, the relationship that we're all sharing with everything.
So when I hear you talk, it gives me this vision of you approaching, let's just say, another person, you know, with such a clean, empathetic, matter of fact state. You're coming to people and you're appreciating the essence of their truth and allowing them in your own mind total latitude for their truth. So what I'm seeing, what I'm picturing is that this helps you relate to others in a very in a great, wonderfully unbiased way.
So
That
their truth isn't true if it's not our truth in an absolute sense.
mm-hmm.
And we've gotten so familiar with dividing up truth because of this
Yes.
dispossession that we feel about being disconnected, that we're desperately trying to cling to our truth and then sell everyone else on our truth. And if you don't
Yes.
believe it, you're threatening my life. And the
Yes.
fact is, the threat is the thinking I'm doing that's already releasing all of those caustic chemicals. The adrenaline was designed to be released during the episode. In anxiety and stress, we're doing it 24 hours a day. It's an acidic condition that actually corrodes and cannibalizes the internal body.
That is exactly, yes, that's exactly what that that level, that Ayurvedic, not Ayurvedic, sounds like that level of fight or flight over time, right? The caustic chemicals. Now, I did some research because I was stuck in a difficult relationship with somebody, and there was a lot of anger between us. And I noticed after week after week after week of raging at one another, like, why are we doing this? And I was racking, one thing I learned, and I'm sure you know this, but I'd like to talk about it, is that raging, expressing anger, is an addiction. That it releases the chemicals you're talking about that are both caustic and poisonous, of course, but also addictive. So a person can be addicted to raging.
Well, consider that what you're talking about, substance abuse is substances. The chemicals in our body are the same substances. It's made in the
Yeah.
same chemical makeup. We're
Yes.
actually using our chemical factory to alter our experience and make believe because we can alter it that we're justified the insanity we're trying to spew on somebody else. And I don't think there's anything wrong with anger, but when you take it so seriously as to think that it's true, you miss the point that if I'm looking at something going on that really is not the best humans can do, generally going to develop some form of anger. But if it's immediate to the circumstance rather than being used to justify an idea about what's wrong with somebody else, when obviously if I'm pointing the finger at somebody else, there must be wrong in what I'm doing to be so insistent on avoiding it. I'm pointing at them, I don't see it in them because I don't have that thing. I see it in them because I'm denying I have anything to do with that thing. That's what I'm angry. I'm angry about the fact that I'm living in the present, acting as though I'm not even here doing what I'm doing while I'm doing exactly what I'm doing. So if it's twisted in my own experience, it's certainly going to be twisted in my relationships. And largely speaking, what I get, I can feel overwhelmed. My daughter dying, as you're referencing, last December 5th. That was an overwhelming expectation for that day. Certainly I didn't plan on it. I knew it was possible, but I didn't think it was really possible. It just seemed like something. So having the limits of my thinking overrun are easy to feel overwhelmed. But what I know now when I'm overwhelmed is what's overwhelmed is the limit of my thinking. It's my expectations that I believe were true because I have some association to the thoughts I think are true. And my expectations seem to think all that should ever happen is what I think should happen. And as a result, that's limited to my thinking again. And when things, so I've learned enough to say, okay, I feel overwhelmed. Obviously, the limits of my thinking now are overwhelmed. It's not me who's overwhelmed, it's my thinking I'm doing. And I can live with that because I'm seeing that I'm actually being given a broader state. My limits are expanding to the point that I can begin to contain the overwhelm and say, oh, this is absolutely within the realm of possibility. And to think that it shouldn't happen to me is to think that it should be happening to others. And somehow they seem to deserve it when I don't. And that's a sick thought. The idea that somebody, and I've heard people say, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I, when they're looking at somebody facing something that they would rather not face. Where would grace end if there is any grace and reality that's absolutely loving? And I would say that is the grace. It wouldn't end. It wouldn't just be for me and you. It would allow all things possible to be possible. And then it would allow us to do what we wanted within that context and either act responsibly for it, which we are by nature, and accountably for it and honestly about it, or pretend we have nothing to do with it and be unaccountable and dishonest. Those are all options that we have. We're free to do that. The question is, when those things happen, do I look at it honestly or do I look at it as something I need to defend because the thoughts I have are indefensible? They rely on my constant chronic attention to be maintained. They don't exist other than that. And when I'm doing that, I'm creating enormous stress because my body knows when I'm paying attention to something that isn't happening other than in my thinking, I am not paying attention to any of the external issues that are going on that will end up obviously causing greater problems. People in Japan, I think they have a huge rate of people being killed by looking at their phones. They're just walking off of curbs and never imagining anybody's driving next to streets. They're preoccupied with what they're doing. And this is the exact same thing. If my preoccupation is about things that aren't happening except in the illusion of my thinking, I'm imagining everything else isn't even happening. That's a major blind spot to being able to interact in any meaningful, constructive manner that would be functional. So dysfunction would be pretty natural. I think we see a lot of that today. I'm not happy about that. I don't want to be happy about that. I want to be disconcerted about that and say, you know what? That's good ammunition in terms of my own reserves. Ammunition would be maybe an aggressive term to use, but it's certainly something to help bolster focusing more on having an honest discussion and conversation than trying to pretend that everything's going to be better if I ignore it and deny it. You know, the idea that ignorance is bliss, that's an interesting concept. That means if we deny everything, we're in a state of bliss. Well, I would say if we actually confront everything and face everything and allow everything to be as it is, there is a certain bliss to that because it's the fact every moment is that way. Everything is always as it is. And to think of it as how I think it should be, again, turns everything back into only what I think. So thinking can begin to be used functionally. The functional literacy of thinking is to notice that all of the defective things that are going on that we struggle with are actually the curriculum of the differences I'm creating within life's terms. Life's terms don't change. They're just as they are. Life doesn't change. The form of my thoughts change. The form of my experience in my life form changes based on that. Not something I shouldn't do if I'm doing it. It's something I'm doing if I'm doing it. To concede that is to begin to actually say, wow, I have been doing a lot that doesn't make a lot of sense. And as a result, feeling nonsensical and embarrassed about it would probably be natural. So I've been also doing a lot of things to look better because I'm afraid to actually be seen by others in the same way that I'm afraid to look honestly at what I'm actually creating. So everything becomes about appearance and this idea of ego. Ego, in effect, is I. It is the essence of I. It is the self with the capital S. But what do we use it as? The small self, the false self, this sort of silly little thing that happens to us, and oh, it's my ego, as though it has a life of its own, is how we think of it. It doesn't. We create it, we imagine thinking about thinking is it. When we think thinking about itself becomes us. That only happens because we think the thinking we're doing is reality, and all of a sudden, boom, we become the creators of reality. All I am is myself. So we're constantly look in the dictionary at all the self-appointed words that change, the words that change when self is put in front of them. Self-importance, self-, confidence, self-ambition, self-this, self-that, self. It all changes. Those words take on a whole new connotation. And self-consciousness, not ironically, is defined as undue regard for appearance. When in fact, if that self had any consciousness, that would be a pretty elevated self we've created. So here we are the conscious self with the capital S created by some product of reality, attempting to create a self that doesn't exist and make believe it's all we are. That's crazy. That is loco. I mean, listen.
That's loco. I mean,
if you've done country music a long time, you love country music, you sang country music, you lived in Nashville. Think how many fewer songs there would be in country music if we were thinking correctly about the misfits and the mistaken identities of the relationships. So much of that stuff that's sung about, it would just turn into love. It wouldn't be about, he left, she took, I got,
You know what happens when you play country song backwards?
You laugh.
You get your mom gets out of prison. You get your truck. your bottle
everything works.
Your bottle of whiskey fills itself up. One of these things I was listening to with Jordan Peterson recently, where he talks about thinking about yourself is the definition of misery. Like if you're trying to talk to, like one of the great fears people have is public speaking, right? So you're up there, you're going to try to public speak to a group. and you have something that really matters to you, and you start thinking about that, and you say it, and you look at somebody in the eye, and or choose people in the audience and directly address them and try to get and somehow get lost in your message. That is a much otherwise, if you're up there and your mouth gets dry and you realize your fly is down or your shoes untied, you start thinking inwardly and thinking about yourself, or playing music for people, or playing sports in front of people, you know, to accept that's the hoop, these are the teammates, like that becomes completely, the thought process leaves the realm of self-consciousness, and now I'm trying to get the ball in the hoop.
Well, and
And
I think part of that, Daniel, comes from we spend so much time in crafted environments.
yes.
People who think like we do, people who put up with us and probably aren't always honest about what they see because they know that they're going to elicit a response they're not interested in dealing with. So we sort of marginalize our experience in these relations. But most of those relations don't involve 300 people when you're speaking in public. And when you do, all of a sudden the thoughts about, oh, I may be seen more clearly here than I am in this sort of cultured group I've developed to hang out with that doesn't ever talk to me honestly about what's actually happening. Or when they do, we both have a little spat about it and we think we get over it. But those things don't tend to go away when they're never dealt with. They just tend to get buried. They tend to wait. They tend to build up. That's why people have these volcanic explosions. Slowly but slowly, those little bits, like you were talking about the survival mechanism. All of that adrenaline that we've been experiencing has a cumulative effect because the present is actually the culmination of everything that's ever happened presently. Everything that's ever happened is the present. It's a culmination of everything that's ever happened anywhere anything's ever happened, and everything that seems to have never happened within that confine too. That present state, all of that stuff, it's all simultaneously here now. There is no real path other than in concept and context of thought.
Mm. Sometimes.
So the other one who said what Jordan Peterson said was Aristotle, who said thinking about thinking is the source of worry.
Mm.
Now, when is this? 3,000 years ago? And what have we done with it ever since? Thought more about thinking and tried to get over the worry. We keep doing the same thing, thinking it will get better. That's the definition of insanity in many circles. But the more modern definition of that is we keep doing the same thing, knowing it's not going to work and still continue. Because what does it do? It always does the same thing. We always have this consequential idea. So what have we done? Claimed that human nature is unnatural, that that's just our nature, that greed and sickness and fight and all this stuff, that's just who we are. We've actually tried to turn it into reality when in fact it's not the source of reality at all, because there is no division in reality. There is no fight in reality. There is no self in reality. It's just a absolute present state of pure consciousness. Whatever that is, however that amounts to whatever it is, I don't have to put words to it. And even in the Jewish tradition, they talked about Yahweh being a word they could use that didn't define God, but defined God by not defining God. Because the idea of trying to capture God in the bubble of a word would be somewhat heretical
Yeah.
and a violation of the whole
Respectful.
concept of that infinite.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So
That's yes.
all of the dysfunction is actually the curriculum of what we're doing wrong that's blatant and obvious. And to see it that way is to start to have what happened for me in the process is starting to see that it was not too much to begin to think of everything and everyone everywhere. Because if I'm absolutely intimately connected to them, I've been doing it all along while I've been imagining all I was doing was what affected those immediately around me. And that thinking only comes from the idea that my thoughts are reality, which then begins to turn my world into this tiny little thing that's so tiny it doesn't even exist. And then I wonder why I feel alone and apart, and every relationship falls apart. And I have people live down to my lowest expectations and make sure they do by causing circumstances to make sure they get pissed off and upset and walk away. So I can say, see, this is true. This is how it goes. This is life. And I've created and manifested the whole thing. It's not just going on in my head. I'm making sure it happens around me. And when I start seeing that and saying, wow, I'm responsible for all this, then I start to see it's not just the immediacy of a wife and family and all that, friends, it's now the world. If I'm not thinking about the world on a regular basis, I'm not thinking about the world. I am thinking about things on a limited basis rather than saying, wow, if we're all affected by each other, I might as well begin admitting it now and saying that if there's a potential to heal, the potential is now with you and I talking to other people who also have that chance to say in their own experience, if I'm as free as I am to think what I do that causes all this upheaval that I've lived with for years, I'm as free as I am to not repeat that and start to embrace it and see that I'm doing something that isn't good, it isn't healthy, it hasn't helped, it's not going to help, and it's insane to continue. And I'm absolutely free to continue. The absolute freedom gives the perspective of realizing I don't have any obligation to continue at all. And I've been continuing. I must be crazy, is the point I get to with other people. And I always go, bingo, you just hit the lottery. The bells on the slot machine are going off. Because it's true. We realize it when we're willing to look at it, that it's crazy to do that. And one of my recent, a guy that I worked with said, I'd have to be crazy to do that. Why would I do that? And I said, good question, isn't it? Very good question. Because insanity is always looking for something more that doesn't exist to prove it does. It's always looking for something in that way. We're always going to continue.
It reminds when I'm hearing you now, just correct me if I'm wrong, but you were able to somehow process or deal with the passing of your daughter as an expansion of your consciousness and a profound expansion of your consciousness rather than increase your fear and anxiety and increase your misery. Of course you're sad, your heart is broken. How could it not be?
Not actually, but
well,
it's still beating.
Good point. That's another one of those.
Yeah, exactly.
That's another one of those. Okay, but being a songwriter, I traffic in that stuff. What can I say? But would you agree with that you were
yeah. Well, the first day, what I realized is that what I was really sad about were the thoughts I had about what I thought should have happened, would happen, could have happened, wished had happened, all that.
Like,
and by the end,
like mechanically speaking, if only this or if only that.
Well, I started to see that I wasn't thinking about her at all. I was really struggling with the thoughts that seemed so profoundly overrun. And so I realized you're just thinking more self-centeredly about your own experience. Yeah, there's nothing to do with her yet. I'm thinking only about what I thought should have happened, when in fact, the beauty of the severity of death is that there's nothing that can undo it. So here we are dealing with an absolute situation, which also helped me realize how difficult it is to consider an absolute knowing nature.
Mm-hmm.
It seems profoundly absurd to limited thinking and finite thinking and the idea of physicality not being limited, because it challenges and sort of, like I said to a friend, Herb K, that I meet with monthly, I said, I feel like I had my windshield washed, like one of those kids came off the curb and washed the windshield. And now I can see a little clearer. If it takes circumstance to do that, that means that I rely on circumstance a great deal for my experience. And if my experience isn't circumstantial, but it's actually prescient in that ability to be aware of this absolute state of being that would be a knowingness that would be natural, then I'm still very much glued in some way, stuck in some way to these sticky thoughts that seem glued to my presence, relying on circumstance to actually expand that. The fact is, no matter how I'm thinking incorrectly, the state of that being, this was probably the biggest shift for me, is starting to say the state of that being never changes when all that changes is my thinking about it. And my experience is largely based on what I'm thinking, not what I know. If I know what I know, then I've always had that. That isn't even experience. Experience is based on how am I thinking about that knowing? So the second day, within the second or third day, I started thinking, my daughter could be a little tricky to deal with. And I started honestly saying, we had some problems through our experience together. And I didn't feel regretful. I just saw them as a matter of fact. And then I also started to realize when when I would say to her, I can't help anymore, there's nothing I can do, that was when she started doing the best thing she ever did. She put herself through college. I told her, I said, you're not taking any of the classes to get into a UC camp. UC or state, we're in one of the best states in the country for colleges in
Yeah.
terms of the kids coming from around the world want to be here. UCLA, USC, Berkeley, all
Yeah.
these schools. Wasn't taking the class. She said, don't worry, Dad. Don't worry. So I stopped worrying. And I said, okay, I can't afford a private school for $100,000 at the time. She said, don't worry about it. She got into Mills, a private school, covered everything. I didn't even know she was applying
Wow.
before she said, I got it. I'm in, done. Boom.
Oh,
My other daughter got a full scholarship to Sarah Lawrence, got back there and said, this reminds me of high school. I'm not going to college. She said, I
wow.
thought it was something different. She went to New York. She said, I'm going to read for 4 years and I'll know more than my friends. She has some pretty elevated friends, but she probably accomplished that pretty
Wow.
quickly. But the point was, I started to see some of the essential things that I had kind of missed and not seen and appreciated as much. And in day 4 or 5, I woke up and had this sort of ecstatic experience and thought, she has now done what most of us are worried about. She has made that transition. This is not something she wonders and worries about. This is something she's actually done. She
Mm,
knows what I fight to know here because I continue to maintain the ideas that are wrong about reality and end up not witnessing that totality. My sense is it's interesting that we would think that we could see life only when we die rather than realize that all that's dying is the brain that's giving us the impression that we don't know it now, that we aren't absolutely activated 100% by an absolute state of being and knowing, that if we simply conceded was there, even if we thought it wasn't there, and started to realize, doesn't matter what I think. Doesn't matter if I don't think gravity works, right? I mean, here's a good
right.
example. They don't even understand gravity, but we all understand that balls drop and our feet will land on the floor if we get out of bed. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, oh, am I ever going to get to the ground again? And yet, when it comes to this other unseen thing, this unseen present state, it seems invisible when in fact it is indivisible. And yet we know it in a way that speaks to the mind's eye of knowing, this sort of intuitive knowing, this knowing of knowing. So to discount that it changes when I think of it is to discount and be irresponsible for the thinking I'm doing, when the thinking I'm doing about my thinking is impacting my thinking, not reality and truth. Illusional to think that it's impacting the reality and truth. And begin to concede that is to begin to really see that to fight within the insane thinking to try to get to reality is an impossibility, which is, in my estimation, why we're constantly trying to feel better all the time as a society and as humans have constantly tried to get things we like better, be with people we like better, be in places we like better, because we can't stand where we are. Literally, we can't stand it because we don't have understanding that substance, that essence beneath our feet, is actually the essence of all things that we look at superficially. Every body has a substance in it, and the substance within the substance in the body, the molecules and all that, have a substance to it that are invisible to our eye, and yet we rely on them to have this conversation right now and even consider our life and our world and our existence. All of those things have to be in play for us to even do that, and we ignore the fact that we're actually a product of that essence rather than the creator of it.
Mm,
It's a major problem, but humans have for a long time come to points when they've made when Copernicus started talking about the world not being at the center of the universe, all the astronomers started realizing that Ptolemy's designs of how the orbits work, that were all very creative and beautiful in terms of their mosaic patterns, but they weren't right. They were incorrect. And all of a sudden they started realizing, oh, that's why this stuff works. We're in an orbit. We're in the midst of things. We're not at the center of it. And yet Stephen Hawking said that if there's any infinite, everyone's at the center.
mm,
So in one case, when we thought we were at the center, this goes for the thinking. When I think my thinking's right, I think everyone else's thinking is wrong. rather than just say, I've made a decision, I've made a conclusion. And if it's wrong, it wouldn't exclude, if it's wrong, it might exclude everyone else, but it certainly wouldn't include everyone else, because if it's right, it would include everyone and everything. And to Stephen Hawking's point, he said, if it's an infinite universe, everyone's at the center. In the idea that the world was at the center, it means nobody else was at the center. So if I think my thinking is real in the same vein, I think nobody else but me is centered. That's self-centeredness, this selfishness that we think.
Is it, what do you think of this statement? We as humans are the only beings capable of having this problem or this wrongness, and yet we're the only beings capable of solving it or thinking or imagining a way, like we're talking about right now, of dealing with it and making something better for ourselves from it.
Well,
because of the great gifts we're given as human beings.
Yeah.
We're this horrible problem. Dogs don't have it. Cats don't have
it. Actually, what's interesting about that point is that animals that are domesticated are the only ones they give psychiatric drugs to.
I got one right here.
But think of it. It's only domesticated animals. Animals that are running free, they're fine. They don't have a problem. But to your point, maybe there's other beings. I don't want to stop at us as being the only ones. It's a pretty big universe. We don't even know the size of the universe, and we've decided we're the only ones in it. There may be other beings. There may be other beings, and they may not look like us, and they may not act like us, so they may not be seen by us. You know, there's an old story of in Tulum, where the Indians had the Mayan ruins there on the ocean. That when the Spaniards came, they'd never seen ships. So they thought they were clouds. They had no idea that there were humans out there with horses and weapons that were coming to kill them.
Wow.
So they let them all come ashore, and they just it didn't register to them.
And
in that same way, when we have no association to these things, we think in that same way, but we do associate to them if we're denying them all the time. We kind of overlook, we say we don't know, but why would we be reacting if we didn't know something that was reactive? Wouldn't be happening. So the delusion starts to become pretty transparent. And the point is, if this is seen correctly, there's nothing we have to let go of and nothing we have to overcome, because we're absolutely only maintaining it right now, presently, as a thought to still be real, and then seeing it as something that history condemns us to when there is no history in the present whatsoever. I would say there is no history in the present, and yet all history is the present. So the present nature of it makes it possible for each of us to simply notice it's what I'm doing now that creates that continued effect addictively, or it's what I'm doing now to realize that I'm not holding on to anything anyhow, but an idea there's something to hold on to, that there's something to correct. That's the simplicity of it. So in your question, Alan Watts helped me with that. Reading philosophy in general helped me with that. Reading the Course in Miracles helped me enormously with that, because one of the points they made is that reality is reality, period. It isn't an optional state. We can think it is, but it certainly shows that thinking is the cause of the problems that result from that. And I would say we've been doing it globally enough to think that we have sort of codependently used all of the population's dysfunctional tendencies to make believe individually that there's nothing we can do about it, when in fact that thought collectively supports the contention that everyone should continue doing only what we've been doing and never look at anything new and say, wait a minute, every moment's new. Every moment is the opportunity that all possibility is possible. Right now, it's always all possible. Doesn't mean that everything that's possible is going to happen, but it means that what's happening is certainly possible. And if it can happen, it is happening. And to start to rely on that starts to naturally dispel these ghostly, haunting images that we've created that cause these shadows in our thinking that have no basis other than the maintenance of that thought that's completely opposed to the idea that it has anything to do with what it's doing while we're choosing it over and over and over, chronically and addicted.
It goes to, it's so interesting, Jack. I really love talking with you. the idea, the word that people look at something, right? A lion eating you know, its prey, and you say, "Oh, that's unbelievable." Everybody
I know.
keeps using the word. That's unbelievable.
Isn't
To
it?
describe things that they're seeing.
Yes. I think we talked
Unbelievable.
about this, didn't we? Isn't that interesting that we would reveal how flimsy belief is by thinking what's happening is unbelievable?
Right.
It's actually happening, right? You don't need any hope in that. You don't need any faith in that. You don't need any, all of, we've largely used hope and faith and trust to trust things that are untrustworthy other than to be untrustworthy, and hope to have hope in hopeless things, and faith in unlimited amounts in faithless things. You can't have enough faith to turn something that doesn't exist into reality. And that's largely been the basis of our thinking. So when it comes to a spiritual nature, people think they need a lot of faith. And I say, no, take the first step in that direction and you'll be confirmed in that step immediately, because the application of your thinking, even if you think you're wrong, you can go in that direction by saying, well, maybe there is something. Maybe there is something greater than I'm even thinking. And stepping in that direction will start to reveal things about your thinking that you don't need to keep thinking about, thinking about. You'll just start seeing clearly because you're stepping into the light, and there is no darkness that can ever withstand light, ever. So the things we think are secrets in the dark, they're not in the dark. They secrete through our anxiety. We get sweaty, we get nervous, we get reactive. When we're standing in front of a group of people, we almost want to faint. We're almost being seen. We can't face ourselves, so we certainly aren't good at being seen by others in public. We got to cloak ourselves in all this stuff that we say, this tells you that I'm okay. I look
Yeah.
better this way.
Yes.
I had a dream last night, I'm just realizing, where I was with all kinds of people and I was running around in a towel. All I had on was a towel. And nobody seemed to make anything of it. So I thought, well, yeah, this is all right. I just kind of went with it. And was, it was like being at the academy. There were thousands of people and I was running around scampering and I was constantly hanging onto this towel. But
Scampering is one of my favorite words, by the way. It's one of my favorite verbs. I can imagine
well,
you
keep it
scampering.
up. Keep it up. So if we have the imagination, if imagination can be constructive and an asset,
Yes.
and we use it in the basis to begin considering that an absolute nature may just be absolute. It may be exactly what it says it is. Like reality is real, truth is true, rather than truth is not real. Reality isn't true all the time. All these things we do to try to perfect this idea that my reality is true and yours isn't. That's what we've been killing people over. So if it isn't true and we keep perpetuating it and simply consider it an imagination, the applicable purpose of it and the usefulness of it will become obvious. May not be immediate. Mine was fairly immediate when this sort of snapped for me, but it came with a panic attack because I focused. Everything that was afraid in me lit up because I was finally facing it. And I realized I was writing about the ego. I've been writing a lot about this for a long time. I was writing about the ego and I thought, I'm giving something that doesn't exist a definition. That's crazy. I'm actually continuing to refine it as though, and bam, I had this. I lost my breath. My body turned gray. I could barely stand up, and I walked out into the morning cold air. And a woman coming toward me almost dropped. She could see. She, I looked like I needed an ambulance, and I thought I did. I thought I was dying. But what was dying was the accumulation of what you're talking about. That cortisol, the adrenaline, all of the things, all of those survival chemicals that had been just devouring my body and my experience in terms of how I felt. And so my body today is evidence of those things having happened. So it isn't in the kind of shape it would have otherwise been, but certainly it has a better chance of healing, since healing is natural, since homeostasis is natural for us. Healing is natural, where not healing is disease is unnatural. So the potential for that was beginning to start to say, wow, if I held on to all that fear and now it's gone, my body's getting better naturally. I don't have to think about it because it already knows what to do. That's a big relief. I don't have to go to medical school to start coming up with all the chemical cocktails. I just know that I've done the best thing I can because I suspect our chemical capacity to create altered states of awareness have barely begun to be utilized because we've been thinking in depreciated terms rather than appreciated terms. And in that regard, the fullness of greatness is, in fact, the great fullness we have for that witness of saying, wow, this thing is already in perfect condition to correct itself on its own when I stop imposing greater defective thinking on it and greater emotional emergencies that I'm creating. When I stop that, it starts to actually function a lot better. And a friend of mine's daughter just graduated with her PhD from Stanford in oceanography last
Wow.
weekend, I think it was. And she said that when the Gulf oil spill happened in the Gulf, she said if they'd just done nothing, they poured hundreds of thousands or millions of gallons of chemical cocktails into that. They did more with the thing they used to claim they were cleaning it up of damage than would have happened, that the ocean naturally creates blobs of the oil and eventually it could be scooped up and all completely damaged reefs and animal fish and the whole thing. So we
Wow.
like to look like we're doing things, again, to the appearance
Yes.
thing. We like to look like
Yes.
we're doing it and convince other people because we don't want them to think wrong and bad of us.
Yes.
When in fact, to think wrong and bad of somebody who's doing something wrong and bad would be actually aligned with what's happening rather than maligned in any way. So
Wow.
I love you. I appreciate you, and I appreciate that you came today to talk.
Oh,
And
Jack.
I want to continue because I think you're helping me make some points that I don't always seem to get through. And two of them for today is that if we know, when you start now walking, rather than simply looking at your own experience, start looking at your own experience when you start realizing that other people know too, and they're also aware. And then it becomes apparent in your own observation that it's the thinking they're doing they're struggling with. Because if you're getting clearer about that, you're going to see it clearer in others. It'll allow compassion rather than spite and contempt, which is interesting that we hold people hostage to our hatred for them when they're actually sick in what they're doing. And it's like in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says you wouldn't treat a sick friend like this. If you went to the hospital, you wouldn't say, you asshole. How did you? What an idiot you are! And yet, when it comes to mental things, we do exactly that. We forget that people are struggling with the exact same thing we are struggling with. They have different places, different times, different faces. Nothing's different. It's the same basic problem that we're struggling with, and that is the idea that we are not part of everything, when in fact the absolute nature of existence doesn't even have any parts in it to be apart from. And if that's the nature of the being nature that we are, it might be worth talking about it, developing a conversation that doesn't continue to reinforce all of the misgivings from the mistake we've been taking.
Wow. I get high on this stuff. I don't know.
Well, your body, when you get relief from the constant chronic thinking, your body starts actually creating the feel-good drugs that we are either overusing when we don't need them or crippling our body to create because of an emergency that doesn't exist. All of a sudden, the body gets back to doing what it's designed to do, which is to have us feel less conflict. If we're feeling less conflicted because we're creating less conflict, our body is starting to actually operate on its natural basis. And the things we seem to only do when there's an emergency should become common everyday occurrences, just in the process of wanting to help each other and benefit each other and give all that we have, rather than some things occasionally and say, that makes me better while I'm sick in everything else I'm thinking and doing as a result. We're going to continue, I hope, because
Yes.
I really appreciate this.
It's my pleasure, Jack. I really enjoyed it. And
love you, brother.
Love you. Talk to you really soon.
All right. Say hi to the family.
Great to be with you. I love doing this with you, man. Thank you, Jack. Bye-bye.